Okay. Mitzvah tzadivov. HaMitzvah hashesh v'tishim hi shetzivonu liyois kol nogeya b'nevei l'tomei. This, the way it's presented in Ibn is not exactly the way we have it in the Ksav Yad. The Nogeya is not there, and the call is not there, and basically I was told that a proper translation would be Hi shetzivonu his tamois anevela. His tamus anevela. Okay, that's a translation. Okay. Okay. Kapach does something which I'm not sure exactly why or what he does, and he says, since the Minyan HaKotzer says Lios Hanevela Metamo, so therefore he has decided to put that as a translation over here, which is not a translation of the Arabic, but whatever he did. Okay? His Tamus Hanevela. So that is it's a very odd thing. His tamus hanevela. We'll have to see what that means. It's his tamus. Very odd verb. It's not a verb. Okay. Next. Then he continues. Umitzvazu koleles. Umitzvazu koleles. Tumas nevela v'chol dineha. It includes the tumah of nevela and all its dinah and all its dinah. A priori, this is a reference to what the Rambam says later in Aseh Kuf Ches, v'da ki elu Shloisha osa minim mitumois shekodem minyanam. He's counting 13 mitzvahs of tumah. Vehem tumas nevela, and he lists them. V'chulei. Kol echad mehem ukosav batera, ubechol mitzvah mehem yesh ksuvim rabim v'dinim utnoim. The mitzvah includes many dinim and many tnoim. And that is what he's saying over here, that the mitzvah includes tumas nevela v'chol dineha. So here we have to ask ourselves, kol dineha, or there he says kol dineha v'chol tneha, what exactly referring to? And the question is, even though he doesn't use the word fikah over here when he talks about dinim, but he usually doesn't talk about dinim when he's mentioning the mitzvah. The dinim usually mentioned later. So maybe it's a reference to Shurish Zion, and he's trying to say that all the different expressions of Tumas Nevela, whether it's Maga or Masa, or whatever it is, which could have been Fikeh, it all is subsumed under one mitzvah called Nevela. Tumas Nevela, u'mitzvah zu koleles Tumas Nevela b'chol dinah. Any expression of the Tumas Nevela would be under the same mitzvah called Tumas Nevela. That's the problem. The reason why I'm suggesting this is the mention of the mitzvah zu koleles tumas nevela chol dineha usually talks about dinim at the end. And here he's talking about the beginning. Maybe it's a reference, because example, you look at the end of Shurish, the seventh Shurish. The Rambam basically quotes a Kadmon, maybe it's of Sadigain. Of Sadigain we see 10. he quotes as one of the Kadmonim that had 11 mitzvahs of Tumas Saras. And he says they're not separate mitzvahs, Fikah. It's a different expression of the mitzvahs of Tumas Saras. See here also the various Tumas Nevela v'chol dinei are expression of the mitzvah of Tumas Nevela and not separate mitzvahs. Okay. Now, the next step. I'm not sure if I should spring this on you now, but I'm sure you'll find it interesting, I hope. You see, when we talk about Tumas Nevela, we talk about a behema tmeya, shemesa, or behema tehera, shlei nishchata, properly. But what about oath? What about nivlas oif toho? Is that subsumed under this mitzvah? Okay, nivlas oif toho. So it's interesting, when you look at the Minyan HaKotzer, the Rambam quotes a pasuk. See here, there's no pasuk quoted. Right? In the mitzvah, we didn't quote a pasuk. But the Minyan HaKotzer, he quotes, he says like this, Leo is called Negeya b'nevela tomei, Shenema v'chiyomus min ha-behema v'chulei. So that's striking. That seems to limit it to nivlas behema, okay, as opposed to nivlas oif toho. You know, if you want to look around, you find this problem we had many times, because you remember Shiur Yud Beis, when he talks about the Ma'aseh Chatos, the Ma'aseh Oila doesn't mention Oifus there at all. He talks about Behema. So it's never clear to me what's going on, but especially over here, we're saying that we postulate the mitzvah because of the Pesuk in Torah Shebiksav, and he only quotes the Pesuk about Behema. It becomes a little bit interesting what happens with Oif. Now, one could take this position and say that Nivlas Oif Torah is not included here. So the question is, where do you put it, or do you put it? So after, noticing the lashon over here, the Lashonis, I found something very interesting, okay? I said to myself, let's open up the Hagdoma to say the Tyrus and see how the Rambam suggests or organizes the mitzvah of Tumas Nevela. So it's very interesting, especially if you have at your hands Madura Kam Madura Basra. It goes like this. In the Hagdoma, the Rambam in Nevela, he suggests two ovois de Rabbanan in Nevela. The first one is Shchitas Goy, okay? And the second one, the Abba Sheni, Nivlas Ha'oif HaToho, Dafka. V'hu, Shenivlas Ha'oif Bein Tomei, Bein Toho, Ein Loi Tuma Min HaTeira. So the word Min HaTeira should ring many bells and say something to do with Minyan HaMitzvos. And then we understand why the Minyan HaKotzer should say behemo, and maybe it is only behemo over here. Ubeferish omu nivlis oif atoha eino min atera. I don't know what beferish is, but eino min atera. Ve'ein ela midivli sefer. Okay, but once you say eino min atera, his smichu ezer liomu yis'ala nevelu treifel lo yochel. But it means the chachamim will masmich, or it's midivli sefer, but it's not min atera. So it's not a pirush makubal, and it shouldn't be miyam mitzvahs. Okay, so then it's a very simple thing. It's exactly where he presents what he has in Minyan HaKotzer, which was written prior to Mishnah Torah, and really is like a sequel of the Minyan. It's a sequel of Minyan HaMitzvos itself. It's post Pirush HaMishnayos, but it's prior to Mishnah Torah. So maybe the Minyan HaKotzer reflects the Madua Kama Pirush HaMishnayos, and that's what we conclude. And you also find the Madua Kama in Paula, Meseches Paula, in Periches Mishnah Dalet. The same thing, that it's not Minarais, it's not Minatera. However, the Rambam changed his mind. In Madua Basra, he says, Ein loy tuma. He says very clearly that it's Minatera. He says like this: V'ava sheni nivlas oif toho dafka. V'hu shenivlas ha'oif bein tomei bein toho ein loy tuma minatera beferish. You don't see it in Torah Shabbat explicitly. Ulefikach manisa oisei bein elo ha'avos d'Rabbanan. He basically is trying to explain why he's putting it in the wrong place, but really putting it in the other place. See, in the Madua Kama, where he put it was in the right place. That's very interesting. Madua Basra, he doesn't want to change the organization, but he wants to change the concept and leave it in the same place. So he's just saying, why he's putting it here, leaving it here. Now it gets interesting. והמסבויר והמסברר לדעתי שהיא אב של תורה ואף על פי שלא נאמר בפירוש. Okay. Mommy has it. והוראיה לכך שהוא חייב עולה הקורס על ביס המקדש. So if it's chayiv kores of bias hamikdash, it has to be an av shel Torah. And if you Teres Kohanim, in fact, points that out, but he's at Tzaraya. Okay? And in Polo, he changed the Madua Kamo, and he says it's Minatera. And if you have any doubts about it in the Madua Basra, in Mishnah Torah, in Hilchos Sha'ar Bois HaTumois, he says like this in Peri Gimel, Nivla Sa'if Atoho Mitame Minatera. That's very clear. Mi Pia Shmuel Lomdu, it's a Pia Shmuel. שזה שנאמר בכל נפש שתאכל, נבלו טרפו, באזוך וגר, וחיבס בגול ורוחץ במים, אינו מדבר אלא באוכל נבלס האויף הטוהו בלבד, שהוא עושה משום נבלו טרפו. So, in Mishnah Torah, it's certainly there. Okay. In Pirush Mishnayos Madura Kama, it's certainly not there. Mina Kotza, you can say it's also like that. The question is, in Mishnah Torah, what do you do exactly? In Mishnah Torah, it's certainly not a separate mitzvah minyan mitzvahs. I assume that it's under the Vela. The question is, the way it's mitame is so different, should we actually claim in an organizational fashion that it really is one mitzvah? Because we know it's mitame al beis habliya. We don't even know what that is. And the tumas nivlas behema is a tumas magu masa. I'm not sure if this is out of the purview, but I'll add another small discussion, very small, to try to put Nivlas Eif Toho somehow together with Nivlas Behem. Okay? It's a huge feat to suggest, but I think the Pirush Mishnayos in Zovim would support it. There's an very interesting Mishnah in Zovim, in Perek Hey, Mishnah Tes. The Mishnah has a klal of Rabbi Yeshua called a metame begodim b'shas mago'or metame uchel mashkin leos tchila. So he really can make the tchila that can make could go another step, because you have a sheni ba'oichel. And this din of Rabbi Yeshua, that this tumas begodim, that which is a separate din of tumas begodim, matamya begodim, shaloi kirish matamov, as long as you're connected to the tumah, whichever way the tumah is matame begodim, so it's still matame begodim. Okay? It's not a matame begodim, but you are matame echad poisel shnayim. But the Ram says very clearly that by Sefer Sapora, or Paul Mesil Nisrofim, or Mitzvas Aseh, or the dealing with the Siyam Mishaleach, the Ram says in the Pirush Mishnayos, when he's talking about that, Elishim calls us, Ein Mitam Mishnayim U'Poisel Echad. It's not Mitam Mishnayim Echad like a Bishu's klal. El Mitamin Echad U'Poisel Echad. Kmo Kol Rishon L'Tumah. Misasik B'Pora is not like Noisei Nevela. V'al Tachshev, Shezeh Seisa Es HaKlal Shoma B'Yeshua. Maybe it's against Rabbi Yeshua's klal. They call Matame Begodim, B'Shas Mago, Matame Oichel Mashkin Lios Tchila. Lefi Shehu Be'er, V'Oma Kol HaMatame Begodim, B'Shas Mago'oi. It has a Tumas Maga that has Tumas Begodim. V'lei Oma Kol Matame Begodim Stam, which should include his askus. So it means Misasek and Paul Mesil Nisrofim would not come under this category of Tu B'Chibur. In fact, I remember the Rav, when he was saying Shurim, at the end, I think it was Sirchas Ha'umnim, maybe. It was Sirchas Ha'Purim, where the Gemara compares his askus of tumor to a different type of askus. So he said the Rav said you see one thing with the Gemara. The metame is his askus. Okay, and that's what Rambam clearly says. However, the interesting thing is when it comes to Nivus Eif Toho, is not like his askus, but Nivus Eif Toho is metame shnayim u'poisel echad, and it's mefurish in the Mishnah in Zovim Perek Hey Mishnah Tes and the Rambam. So it means it based the Tumas Maga. It's just that normally in Beis whether Beis Habli is Beis Hastorim or it's considered Tuma Blue or whatever the dinim are, it just normally it's no Tumas Maga, and here it is Matama Maga. Okay, so then it's not difficult for me to imagine that Nivus Eif Toho and Nivus Behema could be one category. The Rambam puts it together. Perek Aleph and Perek Beis is Behema, and Perek Gimel is Eif. Okay, so we're okay. Whatever he meant here, it really is irrelevant. He meant it whichever way you want to go. Whether Nivus Eif Toho is a Rabbanon or it's a Deraisa, and then it will be included under the mitzvah of Neveh. Now we're ready to get started. The Ram continues here. Vani ezko ato hagdomo. Now, the translation hagdomo, whoever was translating it, whether it's a B'tibin or Kapach or whatever, it's a very poor translation because the word Hagdama, the Mikdama, is a, it's a word, it's an Arabic word which had a very clear philosophical take on the translation. And saying mikdama as akdama is not being fair to the time and place that this was written. The word mikdama probably means a postulate, what is this, a syllogism, or it's a statement of logic which you can conclude something, okay? The Rambam uses, it's a postulate which you can conclude logical conclusions from, okay? And l'cheira, this mikdama, the postulate over here is that this is an explanation or postulate. There's such a thing as mitzvos hatuma. And that's what he says. It's the postulate which the mitzvahs of tumos is based on. Okay? The Rambam uses this phrase. I'm just going to give you a short list just to give you an idea and how he uses it. The Rambam uses it in Shurish Chi to tell you that the minyan as-horos is according to Yonei HaTorah. That's a postulate in how you mourn mitzvahs. He also uses it at the end of Shurish Yudalid, where he's talking about Ein Oinchin, in Shurish Yudalid, we're using Shurish Yudalid, he's talking about Ein Oinchin Elin Kemasirim. And to conclude from that any time you have an oynesh, you have to have an ashara, even though we haven't found it in Fuish Netera. It's a basis upon which, it's a logical basis that he can postulate a mitzvah, even though I'm not sure exactly why. because of this partial Erenchin Masirim. And the most interesting thing is that in one place, Loisa says Samuch, he calls all the Shroshim Miktama. It's the logical basis which can postulate mitzvahs. And that's the same word over here. Okay? And here it's also a logical basis which we're postulating mitzvahs. So he says, Roy shetisko isa b'choma shenisko mimine atumos. Vihu kizeh shenitmo kol min umin me'atumos Mitzvas Aseh. Now, it's difficult for me to imagine that, and I'll explain it soon, that this logical postulate, which he's laying the foundations for over here, is not that each type of tumor is a separate mitzvah, but just the accounting tumor. Because there's no explanation over here why each tumor is a separate mitzvah. He just says, and he just says that these mitzvahs, however you're going to count them, he just says that it's not a chiyuv. He says, "Ein in yonoi sheniya chayov l'tame betuma hi, v'loi gam ken sheniya anachnu musholim l'tame bo v'tiyeh mitzvos aseh." V'onam hayos hatero imeres ki mi sheyiga b'zeh hamin yitmo oy zeh hadov v'metame al toyeh kach l'mi shenoga boy. It's difficult to decide what the Rama means between these two statements, but he's talking about a tumas maga over here. Who Mitzvas Aseh? It's not a chiyuv to do. It's not something we're enjoined not to do. It's a din, it's Mitzvas Aseh. So here, and that's all he says, it is nitma like this, and not nitma like that. So that's what we have. So you understand this postulate, whatever it is only really a postulate. You count the mitzvahs tumah, not why you count the separate, disparate, the 13 different types of tumah. That's not what he's interested in now. The problem is, what do we need this for? And I'll explain to you what I mean. The Rambam has just set up in Mitzvas Aseh a principle that religious law or legislation are in minyan mitzvahs, even though there's no explicit tzivui in Torah Shebiksav. That's what he sets up with our forest ador. However, the Rambam finds it necessary, even though he has the principle of our forest ador, which the Rambam says this is the principle upon which are we to base all the mitzvahs which are din min adinim. And he still finds it necessary to postulate a new mikdama for the mitzvahs too. And this is what he's very prolific about, because he continues the discussion. Vahitamo bi'atzmoi rishus im rotzi yitame im lo rotza lo yitame. There's no obligation. V'losh sifra v'nivlos no sigo yochel im noga odem benivla benevela yoke alboyim. Maybe it's a lav yishbichayv alboyim. Talmuloyma ule'ela titamo yochel im ro odem nevela yelech v'tamalo shebemitzvas aseh mitzvah. Talmuloyma uvenivlos no sigo. The Torah says not to do it. So not to do it, yes to do it. So is it a mitzvah, not a mitzvah? So he says a new cloud, but this is Sefer, he doesn't make a big deal about it. I guess it's a logical conclusion. Or Ketzad Havem Rishus. If the Torah says seemingly Pshuto Shamikra points to an obligation, and then on the other hand points to a prohibition, it can't have the same thing being an obligation and prohibition. So it must be a rishus. Very interesting way of interpreting. But the Rambam doesn't make a big deal of this and assumes that. So you get the impression that the problem that he's grappling with is rishus, right? That's what he seems to be grappling with. But that's very odd, because he's taken care of this problem already in the last mitzvah in Sadi Hay, and basically said that the cases of Shirana are rishus. So, what's the scoop here? Why is he working so hard on something which in the last mitzvah, he's already laid down the foundation? Okay, now, I just be frank with you. This has been bothering me for a long time. I thought this way, I thought that way, I thought this way, At the moment, I think a certain way, okay? I don't know if it's 100% correct. But it's clear to me that something's going on over here, because the Rambam's working very hard, and he just set up a general rule which a priori should subsume all the issue of tumors. I would have said that he put up first a door before tumor, and it's a setup because it's based on these postulates. And the Rambam finds it necessary in tumor to have a new postulate. So what I'd like to suggest, and I can't say I know for sure that it's right or not. If you recall, last week, when we were talking about the various types of commandments, and we had those commandments which were explicit in Torah Shebiksav, those commandments which are implied in Torah Shebiksav, but usually you have a command to do something. There's a verb or something, there's a command, some imperative. If you recall, we had certain mitzvahs like mishmoros or tuma that the Arabic was bikon. And bikon means in the state of. And the Rambam felt that was a chiddush, that could be a mitzvah. The mitzvah is that there should be a tzivui to be in the state of mishmoros, to be in the state of tmura, okay? So I was wondering the strange conjugation, the strange issue of something called histamus on the vela. Maybe that basically is something like a bikon in the state of tumas nevela, okay? But here, it's very different. Because when we had a mitzvah called bikon, and we wanted to count the minyan mitzvahs, it was very important that we had an implied commandment, a commandment to have mishmoros, a commandment that there should be a v'hoyehus masagia kodesh, okay? Here, what we have in Tumah, possibly, is the state of Tumah and there's no commandment really. And it's really rishus. And the mitzvah is the state of tumah. And it becomes very confusing. So I was just wondering, maybe that's what the Rambam is trying to set up, that when you talk about Aforos Nedorim, you're not talking about the state of Aforos Nedorim. In all the other dinim, you're not talking about a state, you're talking about a subject matter. And here, we're talking about a state. I think this needs a lot more work, but I think it's the beginning of something. And it's certainly clear what I wanted to make you acutely aware of, that the Rambam is working very hard over here to set up a new principle. Okay. Now, however, I do not believe that this is the basis that we have 13 different mitzvahs. I would have said that the basis is where the Rambam counts, for example, in Mitzvah Kuf Yud Zayin, where he says that there are 4 different mitzvahs of Eilchin because each one is a separate parsha and a separate dinim. So I would say over here in Tumo, that's what he says in Kuf Ches, there's separate parshas, separate psukim, and separate dinim, so there's separate mitzvahs. Or what he says in Shiur Yudalid, that he says that the mitzvah Chatas Kavua and Oshim Vadei and Oshim Tolui and Korban Oliviyeri are 4 separate mitzvahs because it's 4 separate parshas and different dinim. And that would be each of the different tumors. And then you have to start asking, let's say start like this, Nivlas Toho and Nivlas Behema, okay, they're not in the same parsha, different dinim. So if you follow this rule, how do you end up with one mitzvah? Okay. So you can't flip it and ask, okay, no. So how do you end up with one mitzvah? So here becomes very strange. I just want to show you the problem over here. And I'm not sure if it's a question of caprice or there's some logical way of doing this, okay? Now, let me just show you something. If you recall, in Shiur Shvi'i, the Rambam has a suggestion. He wants to know whether Chatas Nosi, I don't know if he quotes there, maybe Pakoi Moshiach, Chatas Hedyet, Si Avodah Zorah, he says it's all fikr, okay? They're different parashas, and the dinim are not exactly the same. There are differences, okay? But the Ram says that it's various different reflections of different modi of doing the same mitzvah. You do it like this, you do it like that, you do it like that, okay? We could have taken all 13 types of tumors and say there's only one mitzvah, and the mitzvah is tumor, and there's 13 different aberrations, different permutations, the same way that there are 10 or 11 different types of tumor saras, and you say that they're not separate mitzvahs, they're separate parashas, but they're different expressions of tumor saras. And it's all one mitzvah. So how do you define it? When do you define it as all one conglomerate? And when do you define it and say that the difference in the dinim are enough to make a different mitzvahs? That's why, if you go back to Shiur Shvi'i, the Ram works very hard that the different types of behema that you change between the Chatas Nosi and the Pakoi Mashiach. That's not a reason to make another mitzvah. So you can have different dinim, and the question is, how do you decide, and who do you decide what dinim are reason to call it different mitzvahs, and what dinim are not? That's a very interesting issue. But whatever it is, the Ram has clearly decided that at least in Mishnah Torah, the Nivlas Evtah and Nivlas Behema are fikeh, and it's all one mitzvah. And you look at all the umbrella called Tumos, and you look at the various parshas, the various dinim, and you assume that they're different mitzvahs. That l'chayra is what the Ram is concluding, which is an amazing thing. Now, there's more than this. You can look at the discussion about Eilchin in Aseh Kuf Yud Zayin, and the discussion about the various types of korbanos that are mechaper, chatas kavua, or shem vadai, or shem tolui, and korbanot leviyered. You'll find it in a small line tucked in the middle of Sheresh Yudal. The line is v'chein soma kosav l'chol min mehem parasha b'fnei atzma, and that's the reason why each one the Torah put in separate parashas. Therefore, they're 4 separate mitzvahs. Now, let me show you something else, which comes very, very strange here. Yeah. There is the Rambam in Hilchos Tumas Eichen, Perek Tezayin. The Rambam has like this. Let me just read it to you and we'll see. Perek Tezayin Halacha Tes in Yud. The Rambam goes like this. V'chein mutar le'odam liga b'chol ha'tumois u'listame bohem. Shahari hizi ha'kosuv es b'nei Aaron v'es ha'nozeh mihistame b'meis michlal shekol ha'om mutar. So the heta comes from Nozir and Kohen. Okay? Sha'af kohanim u'nezirim mutarim listame b'sha'at tumois chutz mitmemes. So at this point, the Rambam has a completely different argument. Of why Tumas Nevela is a Rishus, because the Torah only prohibited a Nazir and a Kohen, and only from Tumas Mes. It's a different argument, okay? Then he has over here, the Torah's Kohanim. Then he says like this, and this is a real problem. Kol Yisrael mushorim liyos teherim b'chol regel mipnei shehem nechinim likones b'mikdash v'lechol b'kodshim. Okay. So here, at this point, it's almost like the murder, and he's giving you a tam of why you should be generally be nizer and tahara on the regel, which is a reasonable thing. Then he says like this: "V'zeh shene'emar b'Torah Now you understand the Zeh Shenema Batera is an expression telling you something about Pshuto Shel Mikra in Torah. He's not telling you drushes. V'zeh Shenema Batera u'v'nivlosam lo yisigou. Okay. So how is it possible? How is it possible that I tell you you're allowed to touch the Vela, correct? So he says, V'im nitmo eino v'zeh shneo u'v'nivlos lo yisigo b'regel b'lad. This pasuk was formulated. It's not a hektar the way the Teres Kohanim presents it, but it is an Isa. There's an Isa for a person to metame himself. B'regel. V'im nitma eino leike. It's a chiddush. V'im nitma eino leike. What do you mean nitma eino leike? So l'chayil is allowed. Just you're not getting a malchus. What's he talking about? Nitma eino leike. Avol b'shar yemos hashono eino musa. Okay. It is allowed. Okay. So you could have flipped the whole discussion. The minivlosam tigo is shayimos hashana, and minivlosam loisigo is regal. Okay, but then you should have a lav. We don't. The Ram never counts such a lav. So you want to say it's the hadrasha. But you can't say it's a drush, as the Ram says, and he says like this. He says, Sharihi, v'zeh shneim batum losel yisigo b'regel, b'uvad, v'im nitmei no loike. Avashar, so he seems to be shy was a shona eno muzer, and a regel he is muzer, and that's betera. So you have a very big problem over here. A priori, there should be a new mitzvah, mitzvah called Mivlos Lesigo. There should have been Malchus. And the Ram has neither. So you could say it's Talmud Drasha. But the Ram doesn't give you that impression either. And the amazing thing is, the whole Seder is odd. Because I would have said, V'zeh b'teiro v'nivlosa lo yisigo, v'regel b'vad, v'im nitma eino loik, I'm sure I would say eino muza. And then I would have said, she b'regel, or kol Yisrael musharim liyois tahirin, b'chol regel, b'bnei shehem nechoinim likones l'mikdosh, v'levlecho b'kol kodshim. The Rambam has a phrase about telling you how the regel plays itself out, and then at the end, as a footnote, a parenthetical remark, he tells us the lav and you're not loika on it. It's not mitzvahs. So we have no clue of what the Rambam is trying to say. Now, let's continue. So, we saw the Sefer, Nivlos lo yisigo yochel noga odom b'nevela yilkeh. So, l'chera, what it says here, that if it's an ashora, there's malchus, unequivocally. Yochel im noga odom b'nevela yilkeh al boyim. It's only because El Tamo is in the stira, and you took his mishus. But if it remains in Ashara, there should have been Malchus. And the God Mishnah Torah is not doing like that. It's an amazing thing. Comparing this line to Mishnah Torah is very interesting. Okay, now, HaMitzvos, what's the mitzvah? It's hadin. Hu hadin ma shenema lonu bedin zeh. And this means the mitzvah is the sharana, this religious legislation. That's what he uses over here. Okay. Then he says like this, and this makes the thing very confusing, very confusing. He says, "V'mitzvah hu adin, ma shenemo." What was the Torah was meira lanu bedin zeh, shmi sheyiga bezeh nitma. V'yetome. So it's one, not only is he nitma, but he's tome. I assume the word tome means metame. And I assume that in metame echol mashkin, because he's only a rishon. Or maybe to chiburim, that he can metame begodim. Okay, so the mitzvah is that there's tumah derech negia, and that after the tumah, the person himself is metame. I see. Then he says a phrase which we don't know where it comes from. V'yischayev loy ma she'yischayev hatmeim. And this is almost like a colon over here. And he is obligated the same way other Tmeim, what a general Tmeim are obligated in. Lot says chutzamach neshchina, shelo yochal kodesh, ushelo yiga boy, and he shouldn't touch it. I assume it's kodesh. Okay. Now, this same type of phrase we find in Shiur Shvi. In Shiur Shvi, he writes like this: "Ubebeir zeh shehu hir ubeir zeh shehu hir lanu shet soras odom yitamenu." V'yoshiv tomei, and he should remain tomei. V'yischayev boy mashchayev etmeim. Mehachik me'amikdosh. He should be rochak me'amikdosh. This is shiluach mimach neshchina, or maybe more, or not getting involved in mitzvah over here. Mehachik me'amikdosh hakadoshim. V'lot says, excuse me, he should misrachik from Mikdash U'Kadoshim, V'lot says Chutz L'mach Neshchin. Okay, good. The same type of thing, but it's more so Mitzvah. V'anachnu lo yineina eze tum tzoras t'tameh v'eze lo t'tameh. U'bo ha'kosuv levalo lahavdil ha'mishpot she'im ho'yikach u'toho V'im ho'yikach u'tomeh, v'im ho'yikach yamoid zman kach, which he quotes the din that there's such a type of tumor, and then he tells you that it has ramifications in tumas mikdash u'kedosha. The same type of thing. The question is, when he defined it before, he didn't put this as part of the definition. he only puts it the second time. It's not the first time. The first time is in the histamus, what is yes metame, what is not metame. That's what he says. Tachal loy nitmo. V'hu amalnu mi shenoga b'kach al toeh kach nitmo, u'mi she'oy al inyan kach loy nitmo. Here he's much more graphic. And then he says, after that, v'zu hazeh, v'zeu atzivui. Kloimer, yoisei tomei, b'zeh hamin, kashe noga boy. O kishiye etzloi, or b'kilvosoi, or it's oil or other things, or whether it's a mishkav or Moshe, we have to know, okay? Here, at the beginning of the sentence, v'amitzvahu hadin ma shenema ma shehoira, there uses shana. And then at the end, in v'zehu hatzivui, he uses the word al amal. Al is the heyidiyah, hatzivui, and tzivui is the poshet amal. Somehow, he's telling you something of how you're making what would a priori appear to be a sharano into Ramal. What would appear to be a hira, religious legislation, and ends up to be an imperative, a command. So I would have said that the Rambam is trying to answer the Ramban's question. The Ramban basically knocks out all the mitzvahs of Tumah and claims the rishus. And the Rambam says, no, it's not really rishus, because the instances that the Tumah can reflect itself in dinim, because this person who is Tomei is required not to be in Mikdash, is required not to eat kachim. So there are ramifications, and those ramifications are enough to call it now a tzivui. This religious legislation, under certain circumstances, is not a rishus, but an obligation that you have to be noyeg as if you're tamei. And that means not to eat kochim, not to go into the mikdash. That's what I imagine he's using this. The question is, the words seem to point, this is part of the definition of the Mishnah, of the mitzvah. Then he has two definitions. The definition is tamus, or the definition is also the obligation of keeping away from other things, which is separate mitzvahs anyway. Oh no, the definition is one. The mitzvah is tamus, but he's explaining why it's not rishus, why it's an obligation. And then to use that and finish off, and then it's an alamah, then it's a mitzvah. I just want to tell you that the Ramban, it depends upon you with Chevelle and Frankel, it's not clear whether the Ramban removes Haforis Nadon from Minyan, but he certainly removes all the Tumas from Minyan. If you're ready to accept that the issue of Mikdama, or whatever it is in Tumas, is a different issue than Haforis Nadon, you could imagine Haforis Nadon being Minyan HaMitzvos, and not the Tumas. One other point, which I cannot elaborate on, the Ram talks about an Isa Nagia in Kodesh over here. There is no such thing in the Ram's frame of reference, at least in Minyan HaMitzvos, the Gemara Zvachim, Lamed Gimel Beis, is a Machukas Amoroim, where the Nogea B'Kodesh, Tomesh, Nogea B'Kodesh is like Shlokish and Rabbi Yochanan. The Rambam paskins that it's not like it. The Rambam only says in Perek Yud Ches V'Chus Psula Mukdoshim that it's also the Tames HaKodshim or the Savim Lehem Tumah Shari Poislan. V'Amatames HaKodshim Eloika. On the other hand, the oddity is, and with this I'll leave you, the Rambam look at Mitzvos Aseh Kuf Chav Tes, and he talks about Negiah in Tumah, in Kodesh, in that Lois Aseh. So let's leave this. It is a mitzvah. We'll pick up the next mitzvahs next week.